Hi there, 75B, and welcome back. In this video, I will be introducing you to T.S. Eliot. Um, Probably the name that first comes to people's minds when they think about modernist poetry. If they're literature students, he kind of sticks out, and there are a few reasons for that that I'll get to shortly. But he certainly did change the way people viewed poetry and what they thought poetry could do. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. He certainly is a litmus test. We'll only be reading two poems by him, and the first is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and the second is The Wasteland. And you will thank me that we are only reading two of his poems because that is more than enough. They are his best surviving poems, I would say. I mean, the other poems did survive, they weren't lost in a fire or anything like that, but critically speaking, they're the ones that have, I think, the most important currency and influence and significance as time moves on. Some of the other stuff hasn't aged quite as well and feels, well, a little obtuse, a little try hard, maybe. But I'll try not to digress too much on that. One of my favorite quotes by him is genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood. And this line at the beginning, might feel like it doesn't make sense, but sometimes we get a sense of tone or mood or an emotional state without necessarily knowing what the fine details or even plot points or larger meaning of the poem is. I'm trying to shut this door here because there's a lot of outside noise. All right, that's a little bit better. Uh, Got a nice little photo shot of him there. A little heavy on the brilliantine, but that was the style back then. It's coming back in some quarters. Like I said before, he's considered the high modernist of American poetry. In other words, he's the person who best encapsulates what people think of as high modernism in American poetry during this era. And Wasteland is really what earns him that title. And you should not be surprised that he was also friends with Ezra Pound. Remember, he's our friendly modernist networker and patron finder and money getter and kingmaker, if you want to call him that, for people involved in the movement. Remember, he was also involved with and a big advocate for HD, Hilda Doolittle, and also William Carlos Williams. And there's scores of others, but I got to draw the line somewhere. His background, he was born from, a very well-to-do, genteel, kind of upper-class family from New England. And you can kind of see that in his dress and his demeanor, and I think it comes through in his poetry as well. As comes through that he attended a few schools of, some renown and merit. Harvard, which is kind of like, the high watermark in some people's minds for American universities. It certainly is one of the most exclusive and certainly one of the most elitist. And we certainly get a sense of exclusivity and elitism in the work, too. Try not to let that push you away from the larger messages of his poetry. And he also attended the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne is the high watermark of the university system in Paris. So if Harvard wasn't enough, get the French, that French elitism, that French exceptionalism in there as well. And well, why not just hop over the small pond to go to Oxford, the pinnacle of the English university system? The oldest university in England, being around in some form or another since the 1100s. So yeah, he's got a few report cards. Now, even though he was born as an American, there was something still very Britophilic and Europhilic in his upraising, and in his later years, he moves to London in 1915, and that's where he ends up spending most of his life. Now, interestingly, if you look at some Brit lit anthologies, you will find T.S. Eliot in there. They want to claim him in some way or another. And that brings up an interesting question about the canon. How do we define who gets put into what canon? How do we define what is American versus what is British? Is it about nation of origin, or is it about nation of choice and later residence? I don't think we have time to solve these debates right here and now, but that's a way homer. That's one for you to think about on the way home. So, moving right along. The first poem we will read is Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and that gets him some attention. But the thing, like I said earlier, that really catapults him into the international limelight and marks his reputation is The Wasteland. International acclaim on both sides of the pond. And this really is seen as the high modernist poem more than anything else. There are other poems that come close. You could look at Pound's poem cycle called the Cantos. Canto, remember, is the Italian word for song. But some would argue, well, that's a poem cycle, so it's not really a single poem. A lot of people say, yeah, well, it's also terribly inferior to The Wasteland. Yeah, I kind of go along with that too, from what I've read. I haven't read all the cantos. There's some fun parts, but I don't even want to talk about Pound. But the thing is, after World War One, there was a real contraction in his mind and in his aesthetic value system, and also in his social value system. He becomes more ethnocentric, less cosmopolitan, less global, and a little attracted to fascism. A little bit of a prelude for the problems that are coming very shortly in the 20th century. In the 30s, we have the rise of fascism. We've got Mussolini, we've got Hitler, of course, and also Franco. And he brings us this really great term, even though the name of it feels a little, I think, clunky and a little overwrought, but that kind of goes along with him in some ways. The objective correlative. And it is a really great term once you get to the heart of its meaning. It's an image or an action or situation or patterns that somehow evoke a particular emotion from the reader without expressly stating what that emotion should be. So in other words, there's something in a work of art that inspires an emotional state. And that comes from that cultural artifact itself, whether it be a poem, a video, a sculpture, what have you, but without coming out and saying what that emotion is. And, part of this is due to the actual mechanics and structure of that work, whether it be symbolism, tone, figurative language, imagery, all of those things. And I think you'll get a pretty good sense of that when you read The Wasteland. And that's because, I'm going to be honest, you're going to be reading through parts of it and thinking, I have no idea what the hell is going on here. And that's okay. That's everybody's first reading of The Wasteland. So don't let that scare you off, especially if you're an English major. It's just one of those mountains you got to climb. And you can say, oh yeah, I read it, blah, 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 blah. I'll give you some points about where to focus your attention and energy in it. But just starting to read it, you're going to get a strong feeling that this is a messed up bummer poem about desolation and um, infertility, um, the dying of nature, the dying of tradition. So I think it does its job really, really well. Now, the first poem we will read by Eliot is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and that's about 7 years before he writes Wasteland, and it's a lot more accessible in a lot of ways. And to give you a little bit of a preview, it's got major themes of loneliness, the inability to take action, a lack of agency, and how that relates to what they would consider the modern era. The anonymity and sterility of the city. And it's got such memorable lines, such as, "In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo." Um, yeah. I think we've all been in a situation where we felt lonely and we wanted somebody in our life, and it seems like just out of our reach, there are these wonderful, almost lighter than air uh, people that we would like to be involved with, floating through other spaces, and having these wonderful conversations that would be delightful to be part of too. But you are not in that club. You will also find, this inability to make decisions and just express themselves, the inability to express oneself, um, uh, worries about growing older and losing virility, um, some a reference to Lazarus, reference to Polonius and to Hamlet. It's got a nice rhyming pattern, but it certainly is free verse. Also, some allusions of animals, including a cat like Fog, but also ragged claws of a crab, which is a fantastic part of it, I think. Um, it's really rough when you hear somebody say, "I should have been a pair of ragged claws crawling across the floor of a silent sea." That's not a happy thought. And there are also mermaids at the end that will not sing to the voice of the poem. So there's a lot going on in it, but I think it works really well. Another thing I will tell you about Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is that I've also got a fantastic graphic novel version of it coming up. It will be in the learning materials for this week, but I suggest you read the poem before getting into the visual representation of it, just because I'd like to see you create it in your own mind first. And I'm going to be honest, I really like how that graphic novel represents certain parts of it, but other parts of it I think don't fit at all. And I kind of think that it's not lonely enough and it's not desolate enough. Um, Maybe that's just me. I don't know. Maybe I'm feeling a little too emo right now. And yeah, so, and it's basically about, this lonely young professional man. Somebody, I had a student once say, "Oh yeah, well, is this the first mention of an incel in American literature?" And I don't think so. I think he's involuntarily celibate, and at least at the very most lonely and wanting companionship. But he's not posting on the internet. He's not playing too many video games. So it's a real rough analogy at best. And he's not as angry as I think most incels are. And I don't see him really blaming women for their lack of interest in him. And I think that's a big part of it. I think he blames himself and his own lack of decision, his lack of agency. Now, here's a nice little poem about the poem, a meta poem. We could call it, called On TS Eliot's Prufrock. An angst-ridden amorist Fred saw sartorial changes ahead. His mind kept on ringing with fishy girls singing. Saw fruit also filled him with dread. There's a part about a peach in there. Anyway, it's a nice little ditty that kind of sums it up. Hope you enjoy it. See you in the next video.